Imagine, demand and build a world transformed.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us here today for this panel, Solidarity and Recovery for the Cultural Sector. My name is Susan Butler. I'm a writer and artist, and I'm working at the moment with a group called Migrants in Culture, and we're concerned with the workers' rights of POC and migrant workers who are involved in the culture sector. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by a few fellow activists who are also doing some really brave, fantastic, innovative work towards helping us to really survive our current moment of what feels like ever unfolding crises. So before we begin, I just have a few sort of housekeeping points and some general rules of engagement from the World Transformed. First, just to let you know what you can expect from this session. We've aimed to make this as accessible as possible. So you'll notice that we have BSL interpretation happening simultaneously, and a really big thanks to the interpreters who are here with us today. We're going to have contributions from 4 comrades: Maya Goodfellow, Stella Kanu, Shawab Iqbal, and Junlin Go. They'll each speak for around 10 minutes. We'll have a 5-minute screen break at that point, just to allow everybody to rest your eyes and take care of your needs. After that, I'll ask some questions and we'll have time to open the floor to questions. And some general rules of engagement. Whether we're online or in physical spaces, the World Transformed is about creating an environment where people can learn and debate with each other in a spirit of kindness and respect. There are a few rules of engagement to guide our conversation and any comments in the chat. And so, yeah, that's where you'll pop any of the questions that you have for the panelists that we'll be able to field towards the end of the session. These rules of engagement are an assumption of goodwill. Even if someone is saying something you disagree with, assume they are doing so with the best interests of the movement at heart and disagree with kindness and respect. Listen more than you talk. Be aware of how much you're talking and make sure that others have a chance to speak. Call out bigotry. This is a pluralist space in which we encourage comradely debate, but bigotry will be challenged. And please be kind to the facilitators. This is all being made possible through the work of many, many volunteers. And so we appreciate you keeping that in mind. I believe we've got a transcription of the session happening as well. And please do keep in mind that the World Transformed is completely free, but it's only made possible through contributions from supporters. And so if you are able to support this work, the World Transformed deeply appreciates it, and you can contribute at theworldtransformed.org/support. So, with that all being said now, I would like to welcome our panel. And so we have our first contribution from the author, Maya Goodfellow.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and hi to all of you who are watching. And I just wanted to quickly start by saying thanks to all the organisers the interpreters. I think that it's really, really important that these events are made accessible in this way, and so it's really great to see this happening. But also, I wanted to recognise all the sort of unpaid labour that goes into these kinds of events. So I'm really thankful for everyone for putting this on. So I've been asked to talk a bit about the hostile environment, and I'm going to try and keep it relatively short because I think some of the other speakers will have much more important and interesting things to say than me about the specific subject of this panel. And the reason I'm going to be talking about the hostile environment is because I'm an academic who primarily works on issues around race and migration in Britain. And as has been said, I am the author of a book called Hostile Environment: How Immigrants Became Scapegoats, which looks at the specific hostile environment that we have currently, that was brought in through the 2014 and 2016 Immigration Acts, but also the much longer hostile environment that Britain has been for migrants and people of colour more broadly for decades. So what I really wanted to very, very quickly do was, I suppose, explain exactly how we might understand the hostile environment in these two different but overlapping ways. So some of you may already be familiar with this term, the hostile environment, in particular through the so-called Windrush scandal. But I just wanted to give a very quick definition so that we were all on the same page. And when we're thinking about the hostile environment in its contemporary form, as it exists as it was brought in through these two immigration acts that I mentioned, what we essentially mean by that is different pieces of legislation that have made what Theresa May, the Home Secretary at the time when these acts were brought in, life unbearable for people who don't have the right documentation. That's what she said that she was trying to do with these acts. And what that means in specific terms is it means that if you don't have what is seen to be the right documentation, whether you're undocumented or you're not able to show the papers that you are asked to show, you are unable to access things like certain forms of healthcare, housing, you're unable to work, you're unable to drive, and essentially what it means is you can't access some of the very basic services that we all need to live. So this isn't even about necessarily living a decent life, it's just about living a life at all. We think about these things are so essential to us that we knew before the pandemic, but it's really been highlighted during this global healthcare crisis. And essentially what the hostile environment has done is it's turned many people, including many public sector workers, into border guards. So the border, which was already in much of our life, has been brought even more into the public and social sphere. And so the way that Liberty, the human rights organization, talks about this in the report that they wrote about the hostile environment is that it's almost this web throughout society that creeps into so much of our life. And the other thing that the hostile environment does is it also sees a lot of data sharing going on between different public bodies and the government, or different government departments. And the reason that this matters, and the reason that I mention this at all, is that during the pandemic, during lockdown in particular, when healthcare was supposed to be one of the most important things that we could all access, many people were scared of accessing healthcare. They were scared of going to their local GP or their local hospital, or they were worried they would either have their data passed on to the Home Office or that they would be charged. Because although there were a number of stipulations put in place in order for people to be able to go and get tested for coronavirus, what the government didn't do, which is really important, is it didn't suspend the hostile environment in its entirety. And so for a lot of people, what that means is they are living in a country that for 10 years, but much longer, but 10 years at least, they've been told they're not welcome in. They've been told they should be scared to go and access public services. And then this pandemic happens and there is no big counter message from government telling them that it's okay to go and access healthcare. And for a lot of people, it doesn't feel okay to go and access healthcare because this sort of hostility has been injected into the system. And so I think it's really important to be looking at the specific nature of the hostile environment now. But the reason why I think we should also broaden it out is that, unfortunately, this kind of hostility and these kinds of really regressive policies didn't begin with the coalition government in 2010. They didn't begin with the Conservatives. They've been sort of ushered in over decades and decades in all different forms. And we really need to look at this broader hostile environment too, if we're going to hopefully talk about this in relation to, as was mentioned at the start, workers' rights, and thinking about sectors like the arts and culture sector, which is already, people are already in very precarious positions. And so things that I mean by this sort of broader anti-immigration hostility, you can track the debates now that we have now, and you find just so much similarity between the debates we have now and the debates that were had in the 60s and 70s. And it's really important to note in this history, which I don't have time to go into, that race and immigration were inseparable. And so a lot of the immigration legislation that was brought in through the 60s and 70s and onwards was specifically about making it more difficult for people to come from the former colonies and former colonies, but it was specifically people who were not white, so people of color. And so this is at the center of our immigration system, is racism. And that is a really, really important thing to understand in terms of who is impacted and how. But this broader sort of hostile environment that we have, that has existed well before 2012, before 2010, means things like things like people are not able to access services or come into the country. And so the system is classed, is about race, is about gender. And one very good example of this is the NHS surcharge. And so this whole issue around charging people double for the NHS existed prior to the hostile environment as we know it now, although it's been intensified under the Conservative and coalition governments. And I think this debate is a really, really good one to look at if you think about how it was sort of constructed during the pandemic, which is that there was a whole critique, and a necessary critique, that NHS staff in particular were having to pay twice over for the NHS, because what the surcharge means is you pay in through your taxes, like everyone does, through taxes and national insurance, but then you're charged again just because of your immigration status. And so there was a big debate about this, specifically looking at doctors and nurses and people who work in the NHS, and that has now been gone rid of for those people, but it still applies to almost everyone else who has this applied to their immigration status. And so the reason I bring this up, that I think that this is really important to think about, is because the NHS is about universality, or it's supposed to be about universality. The pandemic also sort of gave us this message of universality. So when Boris Johnson was in hospital with coronavirus, a lot of the discourse was people focusing on his humanity, saying he's just a human being, he has a family, everyone should be concerned about this, the fact that he's in intensive care. And it really made me think, what about all the people who are not treated as human beings, all the people who right now cannot access healthcare because of their immigration status, or all the people who, because of the NHS surcharge, are having to pay huge, huge amounts of money just because they want to be in this country in order to be able to access the NHS and even to be here at all. And this sort of, the humanity and the universality of it all seems to be lost, in particular when we get to this issue of immigration. And so I suppose just what I wanted to end on, and before I finish, I guess, is really to stress that any kind of resistance and any kind of fight has to include everyone. It cannot be about choosing people who are constructed as good migrants versus bad migrants, and that's a real risk with the pandemic, is the singling out of key workers is really necessary. These are people who have been doing incredibly important work, often people who are dismissed as like the low paid or the low skilled. So it's not just people who work in the NHS. I mean, it's doctors, nurses, porters, cleaners, but it's also supermarket workers, delivery drivers, all these people who have been doing really, really essential work. There is a sort of discourse that says these people are the good people. They're the people, when they're immigrants, they're the people that we want in the country. But that's a real problem, because what it does is it separates these groups of people, these sort of key workers, out from everyone else just because of what their job is, or what if they don't have a job. And I think that we want to move beyond that, and this is a real moment for this. And I think that this is really important if we're thinking about a sector like the arts and culture sector, thinking about what it means to have to earn a certain amount of money even to be able to come and stay in the country, what it means when you're having to pay these hugely extortionate immigration fees just to be able to stay here. And so if any kind of resistance to the hostile environment in its really broad form, I think has to include everyone, regardless of whatever their job happens to be or not to be, but also regardless of their status, so whether they're documented or whether they are undocumented. And so that's just the thing that I really wanted to sort of stress, is that it shouldn't matter what your status is. The fight should be for everyone. But I'll end there. And yeah, thank you again for having me.
Thank you so much for those remarks. It's so useful to have this basic grounding in what the hostile environment is in order to be able to see on a day-to-day basis how this is being rolled out, and these sorts of moving borders that folks are being faced with every day. Our next panelist who's joining us is Stella Kanu. And Stella, I hope you can introduce yourself to the group and let us know about some of the work that you're doing at the moment.
Thank you, Susan. I'll do a really quick introduction to kind of who I am, and then kind of talk a little bit about how what I'm doing at the moment kind of connects with the big question around solidarity and what recovery kind of looks like. So at the moment, my current paid day job is at LIFT, London International Festival of Theatre, as the executive director. I also have kind of like a spare time job where I'm the chair of Eclipse Theatre that's based in Leeds in the north, and is really focused on cultural workers based across the whole of the north, including Yorkshire and right up towards Newcastle, and is really focused on artist development and touring, and national touring of Black and Asian work, essentially, and work from fellow artists who are marginalized for their ethnicities. And so within the context of my day job, I'm kind of in these spaces where all of those kind of people who are currently facing some challenges exist within. But alongside those two day jobs, I've also, like many people, have spent the last few months in really strategic places, talking and having conversation in spaces where I'm kind of leading around remembering, making space for, building strategies for those who often sit outside those kind of mainstream conversations. And those have been both governmental and sectorial. And that's presented a really interesting and rich kind of tapestry or landscape in which to view the recovery period and what it could kind of look like for cultural workers. But the big thing about kind of who I am and how I want to link this to this kind of conversation is that I work both inside and outside of organizations. I don't think that we are in a moment in time or a period of history where we can decide just to work inside organizations or inside the system or outside the system. I'm really interested in making changes in both of those spheres. So the really important bit of work that kind of lends itself to the advocacy that's really needed right now is my work with something that was created back in 2018, Black Women in Theatre, which enables me to do the stuff that I kind of can't do within organisations often, which is sometimes to work at pace, essentially, also to bring together those who maybe don't have the authoritative voice within a space, and to generate and to galvanise some myth busting around cultural workers, and particularly Black and Asian experiences within our sector. And so being in that space and being around this kind of idea of collectivism and the democracy that's kind of within that, we definitely work at Black Women in Theatre in a kind of collective space. But I clearly and really purposefully architect the ideas around the concept of how we are building. So at the moment, Black Women in Theatre is not necessarily an organisation, but what we have been doing is building these moments, these pop-up moments to kind of myth bust around the Black and Asian contribution to culture and to the arts sector in particular, sometimes looking at the workforce, but also sometimes looking at the work. And we've done that in three really distinct ways. So back in 2018, we developed some events that kind of just brought Black women in theatre together, and was built around this whole idea that if we're going to look about inclusion and diversity and what that means in its wider context, we cannot start from the current moment that diversity starts at, which is there is a lack, we don't have, let's develop some programs, let's talk to a few people. And those of us with really, really long histories understand and recognize that the contribution made by lots of artists, those backstage in organizations, many organizations have been driven for a long time by Black and brown people who are hidden and behind the scenes. And so the development of these kind of events was in recognition of the need to move the gaze away from diversity that is all about how do we create more, how do we create a kind of equitable environment where white sensibilities and Black presence kind of meets in the middle. And I really wasn't about all of that. I recognized that even intergenerationally, there was a moment where diversity needs to look more inward, and it has to be about what is the Black and brown gaze in that space? What is the ethnic gaze in that space? And so that's really important when thinking about recovery in culture, because it's also about the empowering of a particular voice and a particular point of view. And in architecture around these ideas around what does it mean to be part of something, what does it mean to democratically and collectively wield our power that looks inward, I think there is a moment at the now thinking about where culture is, having this sense that all of our infrastructure is somehow falling, is somehow really perilous and fragile, allows us to kind of consider that space. But the most important thing about Black women in theatre, which I think has a relevance for now, is about, you know, the real question for me about cultural recovery isn't who do we save? And I think that that's a misnomer. I think at the moment, this conversation around let's save the venues, let's save the organisations, let's think about the workforce, but only those who are freelance. Let's think about the workforce, but only those who are facing redundancy, is a totally wrong question to ask. The question should be, how do we save? Because in demonstrating how we're going to save, we either stand with it's all of us and it's everybody, or it's a few. And my idea around Black women in theatre and the events that we've done, whether that's the All of Us campaign that Shoab is going to talk about, you know, the We Are Visible campaign that was really saying, how do we visibly show our strength in numbers? And we created this iconic photo shoot at the Globe that just demonstrated, okay, we can have the conversation about lack, but who's talking to these 250 Black women who are already working in theatre, some who have been working for 30, 40 years. So there's something about reshaping the conversation around what recovery means, who it's for, and what it looks like. And so focusing on the pace of change and this idea of what we change within organizations and what we change when we collectively build together means that we can run on parallel almost two different paces of change. Now, one that at the moment, lots of organizations are thinking about their restructures, they're thinking about, you know, they're going through redundancies and consultancy around who's going to stay and who isn't going to stay, and that's very, very short term in its thinking, and that there's a potential that the way that we organize and in solidarity together is both short-term and long-term. So this idea that we can create these pop-up moments where we are really laser focused on an outcome, whether that's, I know that Migrant in Culture is currently looking at, you know, how do we create an agenda around what was to be the kind of festival in 2022 that speaks to now, but also begs the question of how do we need to reorganize the place and the role of culture in the future? And how do we use what was allocated as being something that felt quite alien to the sector to something that feels quite collective and that feels like there can be these spaces of solidarity if it's redefined, to even looking at how we look long-term to Black Lives Matters and how that has really influenced where organizations are looking to in terms of their future and the way that they want to recover. So there's all these things that kind of converge in this space that to me don't speak to who do we save, but speak to how do we save. And I'm really interested in, you know, what do we construct that is both grassroots and that also looks to the mainstream, both in the short term and the long term. And I've already been developing these kind of structures, or structures is not even the right word, but these moments that galvanize people together behind particular myth busting or themes. And there's a lot of myth busting to be done around cultural recovery. You know, we can definitely have a conversation about what are the real crown jewels in the cultural sector. We can definitely have a conversation about workplace experiences that people are having in the workforces and how that needs to change. And the big question about not going back to something that we all know and we all can see now is really broken and has so many challenges within it that there is a real need for reconstruction that isn't just focused on opening buildings and that isn't just structured on those large scale £25 million guzzling organisations getting a big slice of the recovery pot. So that's kind of the context for me, which is very, very heavily focused around the ethnicities within the cultural groups and making sure that there is a kind of levelling in the hierarchies and that there is this space where we're able to think both short and long term.
That's so fantastic. Thank you so much, Stella. Next, we're going to hear from Shoaib Iqbal. And so if you're here with us, will you just give us a quick introduction and let us know about all of the amazing work you've been up to recently?
Thank you, Susan. My name is Shoaib Iqbal. I am the executive producer of Eclipse Theatre Company, the organisation which Stella just mentioned earlier on, which is essentially a touring company based in the north, which focuses primarily on Black and Asian work. I'm also the senior associate at the Bush Theatre, which again focuses on really making sure that we are platforming the work of diverse playwrights and is based in Shepherd's Bush. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about two things. The first one being the All of Us program, which Stella alluded to just earlier on, and also a kind of very brief, but I hope impactful comment on Islamophobia and ensuring that that particular type of prejudice is at the forefront in the conversations during the recovery period that the arts and culture sector finds itself in at the moment. Statistically, I shouldn't be doing the job that I do. I've been doing what I do for about 10 years now in terms of producing both in theatre and in dance. I started school not being able to speak English. Most of my peers are white. I come from a very, very working class background. I grew up in East London in Newham before gentrification, before the 2012 Olympics. So statistically on paper, I shouldn't be doing the job that I've been doing in the industry. However, because of various organizations, various leadership styles that have constantly and consistently addressed the inequality in our industry, I was able to kind of get myself into this space and then develop and kind of broaden my horizons and really understand the industry to allow me to sustain some sort of career. That doesn't mean that it wasn't easy, that it was easy, that it didn't have various barriers, various challenges. 10 years later, we entered the period of coronavirus, and it became very, very evident during this period where we were starting to see formal announcements from massive organizations of mass redundancies, that nobody was really, really thinking long term about protecting Black, Asian, and ethnically diverse workers who are working in all of these organizations. Now, the art sector already has quite an abysmal track record in terms of having sufficient representation of Black and Asian workers. So there was a real concern that we were going to lose a whole generation of future leaders who'd be decimated. So I talked earlier on about, on a personal level, not statistically not being someone who'd be doing these sorts of jobs. It became even more of a concern that this would become even more of an issue because of coronavirus and the impact that it's had on arts organizations. So myself and Stella Kanu, who just spoke, earlier on, very, very quickly kind of came to the conclusion that we could be in various strategic conversations with, particular stakeholders and so on, and address this issue. But actually, it wasn't going to be responded to, because at the time, the mindset was that that was something that should be addressed in 5 or 6 months' time, when really this was something that was happening right now in the moment, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. So because of that, very naturally and very quickly, we kind of galvanized ourselves. So myself, Stella, alongside the Black Women in Theatre team, so shout out to Titi, Anika, Monique, and Kim Morgan, very quickly came together to put together a package of, we called it a rescue package, and titled it the Here to Stay program, which involved masterclasses, mentoring, career talks, a wellness program for all, and much more for all the workers of color who would be made redundant or were facing redundancy. We put this together alongside our full-time jobs. So this was a very, very kind of, grassroots kind of movement that we were kind of doing very independently to kind of rescue the various workers that were going to be affected by the redundancies. Alongside that, we had very quickly put together a fundraising campaign. So we put out a GoFundMe, which has raised just under £20,000. And alongside that, we've had donations from other fundraising sources and have fundraised around just under £40,000. This week, we started the Here to Stay program, and we've had 44 applicants join the program who all have either been made redundant or are facing redundancy, and they have come from across art forms. So we've got people who've worked in theatre, who've worked in dance, who've worked in visual arts, who've worked in music and so on. And it's really, really important to say that these aren't people who have just worked in the offices. This program was for everybody who identifies as Black, Asian, or ethnically diverse, whether they worked in box office, whether they worked in front of house, whether they were a producer, whether they were in an executive position. It was completely and utterly about protecting, uplifting, and ensuring that these individuals who've been made redundant or were facing redundancy would now would be in a place where they would feel safe, where they would feel that they weren't necessarily going to be cut out of the industry, where they'd be given opportunities to develop themselves by the various different strands that I talked about. And we're really, really excited about being able to start this program literally this week, which will go on for the next couple of weeks. We hope that that we potentially could do this again in the future, but actually there will come a time where we have to hand this back to the wider industry and say, this isn't something that we can just do on our own. This is something that has to kind of really be incorporated across the industry and not be seen as this niche thing that happens in the corner. Because actually, if we don't take this as a long-term serious issue, we really, really might go back in terms of the small progress that had been made before coronavirus around making sure that we have a really representative workforce. So that's a quick summary of the All of Us program. And I have to really, again, kind of emphasize that this is, volunteers. It's a team of volunteers who've come together alongside having full-time jobs to really push through this really, really important program. If we hadn't done it, would there have been another initiative? Would there have been another strand of work that might have emerged? Maybe. But in that moment, we had to make action. And I hope that we have potentially inspired the rest of the sector to do similar things as time goes on. The second thing that I want to very quickly talk about is very much linked to All of Us. We're very, very adamant, as Stella alluded to earlier on, that this is for everyone. But we're absolutely looking at people who occupy an intersectional space, who might be double or triple minorities, because what's happened in the arts sector is that we've really, really had at times a very surface level conversation about representation and not really looked into the nuances of those different identities within different communities, which leads me on to the very specific issue around Islamophobia. When I started my career around the same time, I remember Lady Varsi, Saida Varsi, who I think was the first Muslim woman to ever sit in the cabinet, saying that Islamophobia had passed the dinner table test across the country in every sector, i.e. it become a normalized form of prejudice that was kind of brushed under the carpet. And I have to say, in the decade that I've been in the industry, I would be lying if I said that attitude hasn't existed in the sector that I'm from. I think it's very, very present there. So the only kind of provocation that I want to very quickly make on that is for us to be in this really equitable phase of recovery for our sector, that we absolutely must center not just people from Muslim backgrounds, yes, on the specific issue of Islamophobia, absolutely, but also the minorities within the minorities, the double and triple minorities within our different communities. Because if we're not centering those voices, those experiences, that pain and that hurt, we really, really risk, again, making minimal progress. Thank you very much.
Such excellent and important and really potent points there. Thank you so much. I'm seeing your questions and comments. To everybody who's joined us, by the way, these are coming through and I'm noting them. So thank you so much for all of your engagement. And next we're going to hear from Junlin Go.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Maya, Stella, Shawab, and Season so far for your excellent contributions. So my name's Junlin. I am a cultural organizer and producer working across migrant justice, solidarity economies, and popular education. In particular, I'm working with a network called Asia Art Activism that explores the experiences of Asian diasporic communities. What Next, a sector support organization that's very much involved in recovery conversations and migrants and culture, which Season has mentioned, which is an unfunded network of migrant cultural workers that have been organizing since 2018 for the safety, agency, and solidarity in the culture sector for migrants, people of color, and all others impacted by the UK's immigration regime. So we came together, Migrants and Culture, because we began to see patterns in our experiences as migrants working or studying in the culture sector. And beginning to see and pinpoint them to structural policies that Maya has already elaborated on, which is called the hostile environment policy. And the way that we are working now is to think about how do we as migrants in all our intersections organize a culture or organize for culture without borders. And in doing so, we feel as though we are part of a national movement of migrants who are seeking education, health, family life, housing, and the ability to work also without borders. So just as one of the first actions we took was to actually survey 600 workers across the UK on what was the impact of the hostile environment on the culture sector. And we found out that 90% of culture workers feel angry or fearful about the hostile environment. 60% of culture workers experience racial profiling or discrimination, and that 59% of senior management do not have sufficient knowledge about the hostile environment and its implications on cultural production. So this is just to point out that one of the issues that the cultural sector has is that it often thinks it's very liberal and on the right side of history. And many people do not realize that the hostile environment impacts on all aspects of our life, including the culture sector and the way in which we are imagining and becoming a society, which is one of the key roles of culture workers, and not just artists, but everyone working in the culture sector. At the start of this year, we organized an activation day to bring together migrant cultural workers and migrant organizers outside of the culture sector to think about what are the ways we can respond to this survey. So these like abysmal statistics that we realized it wasn't just a small group of migrants that were feeling this, but very much something that was felt across the culture sector, but also across the country. And we began to build up a set of demands. COVID took place, and we then had to do some rethinking about what does recovery mean, which is bringing us to this moment. And I just want to go back to some amazing points that that the past speakers have mentioned. And when we talk about recovery, we are talking about recovery without borders. So we cannot make that discrepancy between the good and bad worker, the key worker and the non-key worker, the EU worker and the non-EU worker. We have to be thinking about the short and long-term change, as Stella mentioned, and what Shawab said about the cross-art form collaboration. This is not an issue just for theatre. This is not just an issue for the visual arts or for musicians. It is impacting us all. So 2 things that migrants in culture are doing at the moment is trying to really hold this tension of needing to do 2 things at exactly the same time. And the first is the mitigation of harm to the most impacted, so Black, POC, migrant, working class, disabled colleagues, and at exact same time, organizing towards not a reform, but a transformation of the sector, which, as everyone has indicated in their contributions, does not work. And that is where the leadership is. So how are we doing both those things together, and how are we distributing those tasks across all of us? So again, the inside and the outside game. So one thing that migrants in culture are going to do alongside 22 other migrant-led organizations and people of color-led organizations is to launch an advocacy document which sets out 12 demands that could support a recovery for migrant culture workers. And I know we don't have much time, so I just want to mention 6 of those demands, and you can sign up to the Migrants in Culture mailing list, and we'll be launching it very shortly within the next 2 weeks. So the first demand is to set up a migrant-led working group to provide guidance and legal advice on the direct impact of the hostile environment, Brexit, and the Immigration Bill on the culture sector and its workers. This could happen from DCMS or on a city basis. The second is to ring-fence money from culture recovery funding and budgets under the 2020 Comprehensive Spending Review for the legal support of migrant culture workers, including visas, residency documents, citizenship, and other Brexit transition costs, alongside mental health services to meet the needs of a culture workforce impacted by trauma, isolation, precarity, and racialized violence. The third is to proactively recruit and retain migrants, people of color, and other impacted communities. So like many other unions like PCS, we are also calling out for no redundancies to be made while organizations have any staff pay more than 100,000. So you can imagine senior, for instance, the Tate, having mass redundancies while their executive board and leadership are still earning 100K plus. So what is that active reform of pay structures within cultural organizations? The fourth is bringing all outsourced contracts in-house and ending all 0-hour contracts. So as the culture sector, we should be leading the way towards an inclusive, resourced and supported workforce by ending outsourcing and refusing to be complicit in any discourses around low, high skilled migrant work. The fifth, which is going to become very topical and relevant, is what Stella mentioned, the 2022 festival, aka the Brexit Festival. And really, we are calling out for the public and all cultural workers to lobby for the repurposing of that £120 million budget towards an equitable recovery of the sector, and funding things like Here to Stay and other campaigns that are happening now. Why do we need a nationalistic rebranding when we've got these incredible grassroots initiatives that could do with those resources? And the 6th is to think strategically and structurally, and for the arts to support a wider migrant movement, advocate for the end of the hostile environment. Because we're always going to be fighting fires unless we name what we really want to go. And the hostile environment is causing so much pain and violence to this country. So we need the arts sector, the culture sector, to use its creative skills, networks, and resources to really advocate for the end of the hostile environment. So these are just 6 things that I know I've spoken very quickly. Sorry sorry, Nikki. And this is very much in terms of immediate steps of recovery. But as everyone has said, we need to simultaneously think about the long term, and we need to be able to invest and hold space for what we want to organize towards, not just against. And if the planning and leadership around the culture sector recovery is privileging the imaginations of white, non-disabled British citizens in positions of institutional power, I guess the question is, what is our culture New Deal? So this is a big question, right? So what is our culture New Deal? What is that dedicated space for grassroots and allies to shape and influence the culture sector from the bottom up and with intersectionality at its core? Or what would a culture sector look like if communities of color, migration, disability, queer folk, and the working class were leading its recovery? So this is something that we're really grappling with, and we know we understand one part of the equation, but we are hoping as migrants in culture over the next months to really reach out and understand from all these different perspectives, what are those structural root causes of the experiences that we're having, and what are the common solutions? So we believe this bottom-up and intersectional approach will give us some kind of route towards a culture New Deal. And we know this is complicated, and we know there are many, many solutions under this, but yeah, this is the moment, isn't it? So as, as Stella said, this is not a time for competition. This is a moment of convergence. So yeah, that's some thoughts. And I think I might have talked for quite a while, so I'll end it there. Thank you, Susan.
Junlin, you did exactly fine for time. It was, brilliant. In fact, I've set my pocket watch to it. Thank you so much for these really heartening and thought-provoking contributions. I think for some technical ease, we're going to go straight into our conversation and to field some questions. I have some questions. A few have come up from the various platforms where we're streaming. And we have time to add more to the chat. I wanted to reassure you that we'll have a recording of this available. And so if you do need to take a moment, inhale and exhale, top up your tea, you'll be able to listen to the playback. And I just have so many excellent connections that are coming through. Because this particular platform is a bit new for me and might be new to some of our panelists, I'll just say that I'm going to repeat the questions that have come up and then kind of verbally direct them to specific panelists. so that our technicians know who to pop onto screen. So that's a bit of tech transparency. And so one of the questions that popped into my mind was really about the title of this session that we're in now, and the way it points to the notion of recovery. So I was wondering if the panelists have some thoughts about whether it's too soon to talk about recovery while we're still kind of mid-crisis. And so I was wondering if each of you want to speak to that question briefly, perhaps starting with Maya.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think I can keep my answer quite short in that I think it's important to be talking about, it is important to be talking about recovery in the sense that this sort of vision of what society and what different sectors can be needs to be, like, I think a lot of the ideas are already there, but sort of needs to be solidified. But I do think at the same time, it's too early in that people are still suffering. We still have a major issue in terms of the health crisis, but then also in terms of the economic crisis, I guess, that people are in now. And so the way that I always think about this, and I think is maybe a useful way to think about, is that one, you have things that you can do now in order to alleviate the suffering and pain that is being caused either by government policy or by the way things are structured, and you can try to change those things. So I think some of that can be about thinking about, in particular with immigration, so what's being talked about, which I think is a really important point, is making sure that there are the financial resources available for people who have to be paying things like their immigration fees, who have to be navigating this really costly system, using resources, pooling resources in order to support those people now in the immediate, and lobbying for some kind of change, like things like reducing those fees. But then at the same time, I think where there is energy and capacity and the space for this, also just totally reimagining that system and thinking about a world beyond the bordering that we have, and thinking about challenging those very borders. And so when we're thinking about recovery in the broadest sense, I would say that it's not a time to hold back. It's not a time to think about what is sort of winnable or palatable to people. It's about thinking about what society can look like, what it should look like if everyone is being cared for and treated in the way that we all want to be treated. And for me, that means questioning the border in all its different forms.
Thank you. Stella, did you want to speak to this question about the timeliness of discussion of recovery per se?
Yes, thank you. I don't know if I've got a really clear answer, and I don't know whether it's too soon or not. What I do know and what I do sense is that there are these continual conversations that are taking place, and part of the moment for me has been about disrupting those conversations and focusing on action. You know, there is a close proximity to this moment where COVID, the hostile environment, the pressures of Brexit, deal, no deal, have all converged in one moment. And also, you know, this other sense, which we've not really spoken about, which is also part of it, which is this sense that climate change and climate justice has meant there's been this relaxing in the moment for people to be in a space of thinking and reflection. And I think that is always a good predicator to change. And I think previously I talked about, you know, this need for there to be both this short-term, medium and long-term kind of view. And so I don't know whether it's the right moment, but what I do know is while those conversations are taking place, while people are thinking and planning and recreating, both financially, in terms of people and impacting on people's lives, I think and I feel that it's better that there is this real close proximity to the realities of where we are in the UK, but also globally. You know, we should be making decisions based out of real life experiences and the experiences that migrant workers across the sector and across the UK are experiencing. That should form part of our decision making. And if it doesn't do so now, then when is the right time for our lives and our lived experience to actually impact and to make a change to the way that we make decisions about what needs to happen over in the future and what needs to happen in terms of people's lives? lives, and in terms of policy, and in terms of, you know, what now becomes culture. And, you know, this conversation is about arts and culture. Culture is changing and shifting at the moment. You know, we've now been in a period where for the last 4 or 5 months, the connection that people have had with culture has been absolutely profound. And, you know, and it hasn't involved people going into the Royal Opera House. It's been, I need my Spotify to get me through the next hour because my brain is about to burst. I've had to go out and go for a walk, and I'm passing these spaces where culture and culture's availability is really close and in close proximity. It's the work that parents have been doing with their kids, where they've got back in touch with where culture is at. And so the potential that this is the right moment, not just to galvanise the sector, but to galvanise the whole of the UK behind culture and its recovery. And for me, I don't think about recovery. I say the word recovery, but I actually mean restructure, because we're not trying to recover and go back to anything. This is the moment, if there ever was a moment, for us to really build something new. And I think that as time goes on, it will become clearer and clearer, and it will become more fine-tuned when those moments of real change and real shifts happen. But while the conversations are taking place, I think now is a really good time. And I think recovery for me means restructure.
That's really powerful. Thank you so much, Stella. Shawab, do you want to speak to this question of timeliness at all?
Thank you. Do you know what? I don't think it is too soon to be talking about recovery. For me, we must remember that we are in one of the biggest recessions this country has ever seen. We have probably one of the most right-wing governments that we have ever had. And fundamentally, despite how the arts sector might like to view itself as being this kind of, you know, avant-garde, maverick kind of section of society, it's still operating within a neoliberal framework, which will do anything to kind of make sure we kind of stay within the status quo. So for me, you know, absolutely, there's short-term and long-term conversations around recovery, but we can't fall into this trap of assuming that it's too soon. We absolutely need to be organising. We absolutely need to be having a sense of solidarity, knowing that we're going to hit a time in a few years or even sooner where there will be no money in the sector. And what will that mean for the very conventional patterns that happen whenever we see economic upheaval in this country, particularly for the most marginalised in our society? So I don't think this period is going to be an exception. And we're already seeing the same patterns of people being disproportionately affected by all aspects of COVID, you know, both within the cultural sector and outside. So, and I say that in terms of the various protected characteristics. So if we are going to really utilize and capture this moment, we can't afford to, you know, assume that it's too soon to be talking about recovery, because our kind of, you know, the opposing arguments on the right, and I say that not to identify a group of people that are, you know, so far right that they're never going to be in the cultural sector. Actually, some of that thinking is very much in the sector that we all kind of belong in or are commenting on. And those individuals are already organising, whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously, to make sure that the status quo remains. So we absolutely need to be organising with a sense of urgency.
Thank you. Yeah, and we have a contribution here on the YouTube stream saying maybe when we feel it's urgent and need to speak, that's the right moment. So thanks, Comrade, for that contribution. Junlin, do you have some thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, sure. I think what your question points to, Susan, is almost this is it too soon, is also related to capacity and fatigue, and the fact that we have just gone through a historic moment or series of moments that has changed everything and exacerbated all the inequalities of the past. And I think I once went on a training program with Neon movement organizers, and one really useful thing that they gave me was that actually we are working in a movement ecology, and we all don't need to do the same thing. If we find our bit in this in the world, and if we do that well, everyone else is doing that, we can achieve something. So again, with that kind of movement ecology thinking, if we approach recovery as a collective task, what are the things that individually and in smaller groups we can do and push forward, knowing that other people are pushing forward towards the same goals. So if you're rooted in harm mitigation, into healing in the inside or outside institution game, then do that. But have those moments when we're collectively coming together to make sure we're moving in the same direction. And then maybe in a slightly different way of answering it, I've always been inspired by what Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Imarisha have talked about in terms of organizing. And they talk about organizing as science fiction. And science fiction is time traveling. And in time traveling, we always know that the present moment is also the past and the future. So we're always going to be working across these multiple generations before us and in front of us. So maybe we can be slightly more relaxed with the question of soonness or lateness.
Thanks so much. I would like to bring in a question from a comrade that's coming to us via YouTube. And wanting to maybe direct this to Stella. And if there are any other panelists who feel like you want to chip in something in particular, can you just give me a nudge on the private chat and I'll make sure to loop you in. But let's see if, Stella, if you want to field this one, can Black and Brown-led arts projects start to counter the right-wing culture war narrative, especially older white working class voters who've bought into the demonization of minorities?
I don't know. I don't know if that's where the fight needs to be for the moment. And that's partly to do with where my gaze has kind of slightly shifted. I think that there is always 101 battles, and there's a real, and having been involved in some of those kind of government conversations, it is absolutely mind-blowing to me how even with facts, statistics, and information, there is an inability to shift from this sense of what culture is and who culture is for and who is delivering culture. And I'm not convinced that that war is winnable. And I'm not sure that that is the war that we need. I'm very much interested and focused on how do we empower ourselves to do the things that we need to do? Because if there is any shift to come in time, it's going to come not from those quarters that are signing off these big packages, but actually, you know, it's kind of connected with my real belief that culture is its own power within itself, and that where the funding might go may not be where the influence and power really is, because culture is a power unto itself. So I'm not sure if I see that as a kind of really important line of inquiry right now, because I think there is a need to take the gaze away from these people, away from these spaces, away from the kind of historical mainstream, because there is a sense that you know, that kind of space, both culturally with a big C and culturally with a small c, has really focused on encouraging all of us to be incredibly individualistic, even in terms of, you know, how we tell our stories. And so that the collective story of what it means to be living in the UK right now is undermined, is sidelined, is hidden. And so for me, I kind of feel like until we are as individuals empowered and solidified in what we bring to the table, we won't be able to have any sense of how we collectively can bring that together to organize in a really powerful way and also in a grassroots way. So for me, I understand the question. I hear the question. I think maybe there is something that can be done, but I guess I throw the question back by saying, is that the real priority and the vital question for now? And I think not.
Thank you. We have another question from a comrade that's coming at us from YouTube. And I'm hoping that we can hear from perhaps Maya first, and then maybe Shoaib on this question. And the questioner asks, what are the pinch points? Where should we collectively focus our energies at the moment to make the biggest impact? And so Maya, do you have some thoughts on this subject?
Sorry, yeah, I have still haven't learned to unmute myself. I think it sort of depends on what exactly you're trying to impact. So maybe Shoaib is better placed to answer this in terms of thinking about arts and culture. But I guess there is, it brings, I think this question actually brings us back to the question that we were already asked about, should we be thinking about recovery or not? And I think there's two overlapping ways that others have been speaking about recovery, which is one, thinking about like the immediate, what are the fights that you can win that are winnable now, and what are necessary in order to sort of focus your energies on, and then what is the way to make an impact in the longer term. And I don't think those two things are necessarily separate, but I do think that they in some ways are slightly different. And so I think that like a good example for this more broadly, so maybe I'm unhelpfully broadening out the discussion, but is thinking about the discourse around people crossing the channel. And I think there's sort of two things you can think about there. One is that there's an immediate need. So there's an immediate need to sort of counter some of the narrative, but also there's an immediate need of people making those journeys when they arrive, but also people who are still going to make those kinds of journeys. And so I think there's things you can do around, giving resources if you have any, but giving time, if you have any time, to organisations that already exist doing that kind of work, trying to change that narrative. But then I think there's a much broader question there about why is it that some people can't move in this way? And so in the sort of broader sense, I think that people, as has already been said, different people can do different things in relation to this. And so I think it's useful to think about it in the way that others have already spoken about it, is this sort of short, medium and long term. And for me, the long term is something that also really matters here when we're thinking about the hostile environment, because it is not only those policies that I talked about right at the start, it is this much more broader way of understanding movement and understanding borders. And that for me is where I think some of the major pushback can and should happen in the longer term, which is to just question the legitimacy of these things that we're told are necessary. And one of the reasons I say that is not because I think we should be doing everything in a sort of reactive way, but I often think about the right, and the right don't frame their arguments in terms of what they think is winnable. They sort of hammer at it for a very long time, and then achieve, leaving the European Union or whatever it is that Nigel Farage has been wanting to do for the past 20 years. And so for me, some boldness on thinking about borders and challenging the idea of borders is sort of where we can also be focusing energies.
Over the past few years, one of the groups that I've been really empowered and energized by was around the time when Jeremy Corbyn became leader of the Labour Party, and the influence that momentum had on particularly the 2017 election. And I think, translating some of that to the culture sector is absolutely something that we should really be focusing our energy on. I think at the moment, in terms of any discourse or conversation or debate around equity, there still is a sense of fragmentation. And for example, I'm not convinced that the theatre sector is always speaking to the dance sector, or whether those two sectors are talking to the music industry, when fundamentally there's a common through line amongst all of those parts of the cultural sector that really absolutely need a common unity to then take on some of those bigger conversations. So I think in this current moment, there absolutely needs to be that kind of priority, but within that, not letting those groups kind of crumble because of inter-community dynamics and tensions. So I think absolutely focusing on that kind of wider collective of different art forms and different parts of the sector, but also within that having some real kind of internal conversations that will eventually prevent the breaking down of all of those groups. Just going back on what Maya said earlier on about the right, I think the right are very, very good at, uniting despite all the internal divisions that they might have. I think on the left, and particularly within the culture sector, there is a bit of work to be done around that kind of common unity to avoid the breakdown of these particular moments. So in short, we need a collective group that encompasses all of the cultural industry, but still has internal conversations to avoid breaking them down.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add, and I guess in some ways I'm kind of expanding on Shoab's comment, and this probably sounds like a weird answer, but I really think that the need for us to galvanize our energies around healing of individuals and of collective groups is really important. And that isn't just focused on COVID-19 and the impact of death and illness and sickness and how that's kind of generated. But this has been both a national and a global moment. And what we've had in our history to kind of guide us is this sense that between the end of the 1950s to the beginning of the 80s, there was something in the region of 62 to 64 independent countries that gained their independence. And one of the real hindrances has always been, in those early years, this sense of trauma, national trauma, that in some ways wasn't always dealt with. There was this need to organize and democratize, and now we've got this space, we've got to get into this space. And what we have seen since those years, and where some countries are now celebrating 50 plus years, is the impact of that trauma. And that happens in those kind of global and national spaces. And so for me, I also think, which is why I was talking earlier about, the power of culture, is that I think there is a need for both national and global healing, and culture needs to be at the heart of that. So I think while we're organizing around the issues, as cultural and arts workers, we also, understand and believe and know the power of the art forms and the culture that we are custodians of, or that we're practitioners of. How do we create some conversations that allow us to focus on the arts as being some kind of balm to the nation? And I think that's an important conversation that could get lost. And how do we heal both nationally, and that's all of us who are here in the UK right now. How do we use culture to enable us to do that? How do we repurpose and recenter the need for healing so that we don't repeat the mistakes and some of the laborious longevity in terms of the impact and the effects of trauma in the future?
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm quite interested in the idea of culture without borders that I heard from Junlin, and that also comes up in conversations from time to time. So I wondered if I could nudge Junlin to tell us a little bit more about what you might mean by being able to be a cultural worker without borders. And this also might be something that Maya would like to speak to as well when Junlin's finished.
Thanks, Susan. So I guess when we were thinking about, as migrants and culture, what do we want to move towards rather than against, we always used to talk about ourselves as a group of migrants that were organizing against the hostile environment. That was very much our tagline. What were we doing? We were organizing against the hostile environment. And, you know, very much provoked by another colleague from Zrinka Bralo from Migrants Organize. She has always said to us, you work in culture, make me a new culture. And that has stayed as a simple yet extremely complicated provocation, which I'm trying to understand. And Culture Without Borders is part of that. So one of the most brilliant things I think we're witnessing is how the abolitionist movement is gaining so much public recognition, not just as something that is about defunding the police, getting rid of prisons, detention centers, and borders, but very much articulating and practicing what is that community-centered response. What happens when you place healing and transformative justice instead of an incarceral form of justice. And so in my head, I've been thinking about terms around what does it mean to abolish all citizenship? What does it mean to abolish borders? What do we replace with it? And as culture makers, how are we embedding that and envisaging, you know, collective well-being? Yeah, and I think, again, there is no single answer, because I think we're all gifted with a particular task or a particular passion to do something. But I think it is like, how can we collectively move towards healing, well-being, and a culture that gives space for alliance building as well. There's an amazing author who is both Jewish, disabled, has like African descent, and she talks about radical lineages and understanding what it means to be part of so many different histories and to come to terms and reconcile your own histories and what that means for the future. And I think maybe in what Stella is saying about culture being a balm for us, this is what we need to be moving towards. That's a slightly convoluted answer.
I think that this is it's a very good question. I think it's a really good starting point to think about some of the things we've been discussing. And I suppose for me, I actually sometimes feel quite uncomfortable with the word culture, in part because of the way that I guess I've engaged with it through my work, which is one of the major arguments that's made against immigration over the past 4 or 5 decades is that it disrupts British culture. So like culture in, I guess, maybe this slightly more expansive, vague, difficult to pin down way. And I think there's something here about thinking about the fact that culture, whatever we mean by that, is shifting. It's not static. It's always moved. It's always different in different places, even for different people, even for people who live next door to one another. How they conceptualize what culture is going to be really different. And so this really pernicious argument that immigration is this really damaging thing for British culture, I think there's a really useful way. It is really useful to think about culture without borders, because that has always been what culture is. And that will always be what culture is. So although it's used in this, it's used by the right and also the mainstream to argue against immigration and to argue for this very static thing, actually it's always been a shifting thing. It's always been global. And so it's quite useful way to think about this is in the sense that I think what Shawab was talking about in terms of the right are very good at sort of at agreeing and working together at particular times and working across borders. And so when we're thinking about this and when we're thinking about how we conceptualize of a world without borders, we can think about all the ways that that world already exists without downplaying the very, very real ways that people are policed and bordered the way their lives are damaged and the violence they encounter because of the borders that do exist. I think at times it's really worth thinking about these moments where those borders aren't there or they cease to matter as much. And something that I think is useful is thinking about what Paul Gilroy talks about, which is what he calls conviviality. So this thing that people all over the world can get along with each other and fall out and not get on along these sort of over these lines that they're told are impossible to cross, these boundaries that are so difficult to cross. And so I think we already know that it's there, it's already happening. And just looking to these points where it happens, I think is a really, really useful way for imagining those worlds in the future.
Thank you so much. And it's interesting to hear your remarks, Jess and Maya. As we were talking, I just added something down, which is for conservatives, culture is something we inherit. For visionaries, culture is something we bequeath. So just a little pearl that happened to pop out just then. I'd like to put one last question that's coming from YouTube to our panelists. If you could each offer a thought that speaks to this question, perhaps, in closing. And I propose we just use the same running order, Maya, then Stella, then Shoab, then Junlin. And the question is about or this questioner expresses the need to develop tools to push back against a return to normal in an everyday professional context. And so I'm wondering if the comrades joining us on the panel just have some brief thoughts about that.
I think the other panelists will probably be better placed to talk about the specificity of what this panel is about. But I think from the first, from the first starting point of recognizing the things that have shifted and for who, and so the return to normal is the and the question says in an everyday professional context. I think we really need to recognize in this moment that people are experiencing this in very, very different ways. And although there is this sort of broader discourse that is suggesting we all need to return to normal, who is being forced to, who is able to push back against that, and where power is in this, I think is really, really important. And so if we're even thinking about developing tools, which I don't know that I have the answer to that, I think that the really, really important thing is to center the very things that have been talked about in this panel. So thinking about power inequalities, thinking about who is impacted the most and in what ways in this particular moment, and thinking about what the problem with what normal was for different people and in different ways is really, really important. But I think probably other panelists have more concrete things that they could probably speak to on that. So the thing that I would really highlight there is recognizing the different ways that normal was a problem for different people, and how different people even now are being treated differently depending on where they sit in society and what their job is.
I think Maya has absolutely hit the nail on the head in terms of the context, and what that then means is that for the last few months have really revealed to us exactly where those inequalities lie, exactly where those differences in experiences lie. If that means that normality is a high percentage of our sector relying on freelancers and people on 0-hour contracts, at a really high percentage, it is at 80%. 76% of the sector is reliant on a whole group of people who are now in a space where their finances and their financial situation is even more precarious. We've got restructuring happening in large-scale organizations, which is also holding the bulk of migrant workers. That percentage is also going to shift and change, and the experiences within that context. We've also got that in the last few months, Black Lives Matters has really shifted and brought into sharp focus, the whole concept around the very nature of our organizations and the very nature of the work that we do, and how that relates and links to audiences. How do we go back to a normal? I cannot envisage a normal that is acceptable with those astounding figures and statistics that we have all been grappling with, and that have been shared with government in some of the oral and written evidence that we've been giving around our sector. I don't know whether a return to normal is feasible. It absolutely isn't feasible. And the fact that the last few months have really highlighted that our normal is both diseased, toxic, absolutely not fit for purpose in so many ways. And that is at every scale. That's not just laying that down at the door of the large scale organizations. That's the way that we work. And so for me, a return to normal is absolutely cannot be on the table. What is on the table, and I think I kind of alluded to this before, is what do we need to build to ensure that all of us remain? What do we need to build to ensure that there is a cultural sector to deliver over the next 5 and 10 years and beyond? And what does it mean for everybody to be included? Those questions still remain, and they have nothing to do with a sense of normality that is a return to a system that is built on, predicated on 200-year-old, memorandum and articles that loads of charities are working on at the moment, and most of our organizations are charities. They're 200 years old, based on prejudices and biases that we know are being exposed, both in our society, but also within our day-to-day working relationships. It's impossible for us to return to a normal.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what Stella said in terms of it. It's really, I find it quite difficult to imagine a situation where we go back to normal, so to speak, in terms of where we were before COVID. But within that, I do think there's, kind of spoke about it earlier, we're still working within a very neoliberal framework in the culture industry. And I still think there'll be some, both individuals and institutions, that will naturally try to go back to some of that normal. And I think within that, there will be incidents of institutional violence that will still be presenting themselves, perhaps not in the way that they were before, but in a slightly more mutated way that's within the kind of the new normal, whatever that will end up looking like. So I think it's really important that we use this particular moment that we're in today to really make sure that arts workers are unionized, particularly arts workers that occupy various spaces in terms of protected characteristics, because one of the things that we really, really lack in our industry is the galvanizing of people coming together based on, being workers, but particularly through their specific intersectional identity. So I think in terms of how we fight back, I think that's a really, really important starting point. I think there absolutely needs to be a culture in the industry which is open and up for organizing around a unionized movement, because I still suspect there'll be incidents of institutional violence, of the same kind of inequalities, not presenting themselves in the same way, but still fundamentally kind of trying to creep back in different shapes and forms. So for me, it's all about unions.
I'm so sorry. Oh gosh, what I was saying was that at this question about the fear of like returning back to normal is also that question around energy and that fear of not being able to do it by yourself. So as Shawab said, it's really important to be able to organize together and organize with. So whether it's a union, a workplace union, or a community organization, find your people, because they are the ones that you will be able to talk with, to strategize with, to heal with, to imagine with. And that is so fundamental, that we cannot be isolated again in an industry that is 70-80% freelancers. That is the history of the culture sector and cultural production. We've been atomized. So I think the real remedy is like being together. Another thing is to remember to just, the work is being done out there. So continue to just uplift those campaigns, initiatives like Culture Needs Diversity, All of Us, the demands of the working class artist group, etc. There's so much information out there, so many campaigns that you can uplift. And I think also to just bridge that short, medium, long-term journey, we are all being transformed in fundamental ways. And I think we should give ourselves that time and space to really understand how all the dots are connected, how all our struggles are connected, what is the root causes of many of the situations that we face, regardless of the specificity of our lived experience. A lot of these things are connected. So yeah, I would say, yeah, another tool is to do that work of self-education and self-transformation. Yeah.
Thanks, that's really brilliant. And there was a question that came up on Facebook, and I think also on YouTube, referring to this question of how trade unions might be able to support some of the specific demands coming through from migrants and culture. And I would say, please drop us an email and let's talk, let's collaborate. But that's time for us. I want to thank everyone for being here with us in this session. Personally, I feel like I have to recover every day, and that the disaster capitalists are remaking the world all the time in every crack and crevice they can find, and so it is absolutely a privilege, and I feel so imperative to be part of this conversation in this moment. So thanks so much to The World Transformed. Thanks so much to our excellent panel of my good fellow Stella Kanu, Shoaib Iqbal, and Junlin Go. Please do check out all of the different movements and the work that our panelists are doing, and see how you can get involved. We all have to be able to give what we can from where we're standing, and also to be able to receive support and the spirit of mutual aid, which is so heartening in these times. I'd also like to mention the panel on Towards an Arts Utopia, which is happening in about half an hour, which I feel is a really natural progression from this conversation. Now is definitely a time for us to have an absolutely demanding relationship with reality, with culture, with society, and to ensure that we're remaking and healing all the time. I just want to check my notes to make sure that I'm not forgetting any other major points. And I think that'll do it, except to say that if you're in a position to contribute to the work that The World Transformed is doing, I hope that you'll consider giving what you can at the World Transformed website with the /support. Thanks, everybody. Take really good care.
View the full TWT20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.